Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Paul Ladd, and I'm the director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, or UNRISD. For those of you that don't know us, UNRISD is an independent research institute in the UN that focuses on the social dimensions of contemporary development issues. Our topic tonight for this roundtable and for the conference that UNRISD will host over the next 2 days is inequality, or rather inequalities, including the dynamics around elite power. We have a fantastic set of presenters and papers at the conference, and this roundtable will serve to kick us off. I'm not going to make a long speech now about different types and patterns of inequalities, how they intersect and reinforce, or about the consequences for our societies, politics, and our environment. I'll leave that to our distinguished experts this evening and for our conference. But let me just say something briefly about inequalities and the United Nations. Inequalities have long been a concern of the UN itself, the UN system being the agencies, funds, programs, research entities, and that has been for many reasons. Because of the brake that income and wealth inequality places on poverty reduction, because of unequal relationships between countries, for example on trade or finance or the consequences of climate change, and most fundamentally because of our mandate on the realization and protection of human rights. Now, generally speaking, governments have been less vocal about inequality, especially for some where inequalities in income and wealth have challenged capitalism itself. But the consequences of inequalities in this present day, emphasized by globalization, have become too large to ignore. 3 years ago, governments at the UN committed to what they call the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and within that, a set of targets called the Sustainable Development Goals. This is an agenda for every country and all their populations, and it calls for a move to sustainable development in its different dimensions: environmental, social, and economic. Now, there is a goal on inequality comprising a mix of national and international actions on incomes of the bottom 40%, on equal opportunity and inclusion, on trade and migration. But perhaps of more significance is the commitment of governments in implementing that agenda to leave no one behind, and indeed to reach the furthest away first. But to put it simply, if there are persistently high levels of inequality, or indeed if inequalities are growing, the commitment to leaving no one behind rings hollow. UNRISD research is intended to support UN member states, their national stakeholders, to make progress on their national development processes, cognizant of the commitments they've also made together, like the 2030 Agenda. And so this focus on inequalities, UNRISD's work on inequalities, which has a lengthy tradition, is very much in that spirit of helping countries to recognize and address inequalities in whichever form they manifest themselves. So before I join you in the audience, let me just thank Imogen Foulkes, BBC's correspondent in Geneva, and our panelists this evening, the UNRISD team who put in all the hard work behind the roundtable and the conference, UNRISD institutional donors, Switzerland, Sweden, and Finland, whose support allows us to pursue activities like this, and the University of Geneva and Professor Pontusson for being our partners and kind hosts tonight. And with that, let me hand over to the professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Jonas Pontusson, and I'm professor of comparative politics at the University of Geneva. This is my building, or our building, so it's a pleasure to welcome you all here. I recently started a 5-year research program called Unequal Democracies, and this program explores the political consequences of rising economic inequality in liberal democracies. So the topics to be explored tonight at this panel are very close to my heart, and I'm very excited to be here. I won't take up precious time telling you about myself and my research. Instead, I'm simply going to read some welcoming remarks that have been prepared by the rector of our university, Yves Flickiger, who unfortunately could not be here tonight due to prior commitments. As some of you may know, Professor Flickiger is a labor economist and has written a lot on issues about inequality in Switzerland and elsewhere. So the topics discussed here tonight and at the UNRISD conference are also very dear to his heart. So this is what Yves writes. Dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of Geneva, I would like, first of all, to extend a very warm welcome to all participants to this roundtable in the context of the International Conference Overcoming Inequalities in a Fractured World, organized by the UN Research Institute for Social Development. As we know, today, the richest 1% of the population holds half of the world's wealth. This situation is doubly problematic from the point of view of equity, first of all, but also from the point of view of economic efficiency. Indeed, the growth of inequalities observed both at the international level between countries, but also within national borders, contributes to a developing sense of injustice that encourages the rise of populism, undermines social cohesion, and can lead to strikes, resistance, or even violence. In so doing, these inequalities have an adverse effect on economic growth, which is further exacerbated by a decline in overall consumption linked to an increasingly unequal distribution of national income. For all these reasons, it is now essential to understand the causes of this growth in inequality in order to provide concrete solutions and, above all, to adopt effective public policies to reduce the social divide. How did we arrive at this alarming state of affairs? What kinds of fractures has this extreme concentration of wealth wrought, be they economic, political, cultural, social, spatial, or environmental? And what space is there for progressive change in a context where those in power act to preserve the systems from which they benefit? This roundtable, organized jointly by the University of Geneva and UNRISD, offers a timely and invaluable opportunity for all relevant stakeholders to share their views on these crucial questions. By analyzing the roots of this inequality increase, it will also help set priorities for future policy recommendations and priorities. Our university is very proud to host this roundtable, and I really wish to thank you very much for finding the time to come to Geneva to share with us your thoughts and help us understand the reasons for the increase in inequalities. I strongly believe that we, the University of Geneva, have an important role to play in this domain as a comprehensive university with humanistic values and proven excellence in a variety of fields of science, and also as part of a city that has come to occupy a unique place on our planet for international dialogue and negotiations. Indeed, our university takes pride in the fact that it gives itself and all its researchers who regularly make exciting advances in a variety of scientific fields the means to share this knowledge with society. Finally, I would like to thank Paul Ladd and Katja Huju of UNRISD and Jonas Pontusson, I really didn't do much at all, for bringing this putting this panel discussion together and for bringing thought leaders, influential advocates for change to this discussion here. I wish you a very fruitful roundtable and an enjoyable stay in Geneva. I'm very much looking forward to the results of your discussion. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think you can all hear me. Microphone is working. First of all, thanks. I don't see an empty seat. This is brilliant. It's a kind of bit of a dark, rainy night in Geneva, and we've got so many people here. It's fantastic. Bit of housekeeping first. We're going to debate up until about 8 o'clock. There will be time for questions for all of you once we've heard from our esteemed panelists. get this out of the way first. When we turn to questions, we will be looking for questions and points and not long speeches, because otherwise it kind of eats into other people's time. But again, welcome to this debate. We heard in the introduction there, 1% of the world's population controls 50% of the wealth. It's a staggering figure, and if you look at the wealth gap, in many areas and cases, it's actually getting bigger, which is a pretty damning indictment of the situation our planet is in today. I was reminded of it quite ironically this afternoon, because I was wearing my BBC hat this afternoon on assignment, a fairly frivolous one, which was to go to Sotheby's and look at Marie Antoinette's jewels, which they're going to sell for auction next week. But it reminded me that inequality can cause some problems. We will be looking for solutions this evening that may not be as dramatic as the ones the French citoyen chose 2 centuries ago, but we might keep in mind, or the 1% perhaps ought to also perhaps go and have a look at Marie Antoinette's pearls, because they survived, but proved to be more long-lived. Right, I'm going to pipe down now and introduce, we have a fantastic panel here for you, and I know that they are going to guarantee us a very lively debate indeed. First of all, Jomo Kwame Sundaram from Malaysia, Malaysian government's group of elders, I hear, and apparently you're known for your unorthodox approaches to economics, so we'll be very interested to hear what they are, unorthodox, unconventional approaches. Then we have Saskia Sassen from Columbia University. She's a specialist in global migration issues. You've written some very interesting articles on the concept of expulsion, which I think we might address at some point during this debate on inequality. And finally, Naila Kabeer, London School of Economics. And she is a specialist in poverty and gender politics, and again, something very relevant to our discussion this evening. So without further ado, I have an opening question for all our panelists, and I should say that they agreed collectively that Jomo would be the first one to answer. So there's no preferential treatment going on here. And that is, how on earth did we get, here we are in the 21st century, to this situation where still we have this enormous gap between the very wealthy haves and the very many have-nots?
Well, I think the major changes which have taken place over the last half century, or more specifically since the 1980s, are often described as bringing about greater market power. And I think it's very important to recognize that there has been a concentration of power which has been enabled particularly by changes in laws, in regulations, in rules, in how we live. And this has been very, very crucial. In particular, I think the strengthening of what are called intellectual property rights has been crucial to the recent accumulation and concentration of power by the most recently rich people. So if you think back about the 1980s, in the 1980s, the richest men, because most of these people were men in the world, were rich because of oil or because they controlled banks. Okay? But the world has changed today. If you look at the people who control much, who are the richest people today, they have virtual monopolies, if not real monopolies. Or they have a tremendous amount of market power. Those of you who are old enough will remember the early days of Amazon, when Amazon didn't have much of a return to your investment. But today, of course, Mr. Bezos is the richest man in the world, by far. And his strength, the strength of his position, comes precisely because the kind of business he's engaged in does not prohibit his kind of his practices. I'll give you another example, which many of you might remember from a couple of years ago. A young man, entrepreneur named Martin Shkreli, had made money in finance. He bought the patent to a drug. The drug was retailing for $13.50 in the US. He pushed up the price to $750. Loretta Lynch, the new Attorney General of the United States, tried to prosecute him for price gouging, and she couldn't. There was no law against price gouging. The holder of a patent, the holder of an intellectual property right, could set any price. I'll give you another example related to the same issue. Hepatitis C. My country has 32 million people. 500,000 people have hepatitis C. The current medication would cost somewhere in the region of about 80,000 US for a full treatment, a 12-week treatment. There's a generic equivalent available from the Egyptians for for 300 US dollars. There's a similar generic equivalent available from Indians. For various reasons, the Malaysian government chose to go with the Egyptian generic equivalent. The point I'm trying to make is that what enables many of these people to become rich is completely legal, completely legitimate. We cannot think about this as something which is illegitimate. And this is precisely why the ability of President Trump to appoint 2 new Supreme Court justices is probably the most important thing which his current tenure, his tenure as President of the United States, is going to have, not only for the present generation, but for time to come. One should not forget, of course, hard power. Hard power will continue to be important, and this is why you have fleets, and President Trump has succeeded in persuading some of the other ruling classes of the world to pay for their protection. Okay, this is an innovation on his part. But so one should not underestimate the significance of military and police power. But more important than that is soft power. Soft power in the form of law, soft power in the form of ideas, soft power in the form of popular culture, and how we accept this as perfectly legitimate.
Thank you, Jomo. Naila Kabeer, would you like to there's a microphone there. I mean, I'm just thinking what Jomo said, have we missed a trick in terms of not seeing how the world developed? I think it's just on, actually. Have we missed a trick in not anticipating how the world might develop? As we see, we've had very new businesses operating unfettered because there's no law to stop them.
I'm not quite sure when these kinds of changes started to take place. I think you talked about the last quarter century. And it really was at the end of a period when we saw, a crisis perhaps in the north in terms of...
You might have to talk a little bit closer, yeah.
A crisis perhaps in the north in terms of trade union power, wages, organized labor, and the capacity of technology and globalization and the new rules to allow capital to, invest wherever it wanted, and therefore to start, in a sense, weakening the regulations that we could. But it has been a very, very self-interested, and you say very legal. I'd like to talk a little bit about the gender aspect of this. And that is, when we are being told about the billionaires of the world, it's very interesting. I think Oxfam's last figures from 2017 was, I think 8 the richest people are, 6 of them are from the United States, 1 is from Spain, 1 is from Mexico, and they're all men. And I don't think, I think in that we capture inequalities of nationality, to some extent ethnicity and race. I don't know how the Mexican is counted, but they're all white. And of course, an absence of gender. And of course, if we reverse our gaze and look at the bottom of the pyramid, the color changes a great deal, and the gender changes a great deal. So we have many, many more people at the bottom of the pyramid, and they're drawn from these marginalized identities. In each country, they are drawn from indigenous, lower caste, black, and so on. So, in a sense, the inequalities that we're seeing today are building on old inequalities as well. So, even as the rich get very much richer, middle-income groups do enjoy a little bit of increase in their incomes, but those at the very bottom have not seen much change. So some of those inequalities are happening through concentration at the top and the concentration of poverty at the bottom. So I think there's a reason why we should, kind of be troubled about this, because as we know, when people feel that there is no stake for them in a society, when they feel that there's no, future violence, that's when we get violence. And we know from the work on this that the sense of injustice and grievance has been closely linked to violent uprisings. And in the past, it used to be these indigenous groups, in India, the Naxalite movement has been going for many years, and it is the indigenous peoples that are the main, protagonists in it. But now we're also seeing a sense of grievance from a different kind of identity politics, and that is the white working class and white men who feel that somehow some of their privileges are being taken away. So one of the very worrying things about ignoring the importance of people's identities is that you end up pitting people at the bottom against each other. So for instance, in the riots in India, in all communal violence in India, it is the poorest sections of the poor who are inflicting violence on other sections of the poor. And I see in the UK and in US, it is the white working class that are most hostile and most threatened by incoming, by newly arrived immigrants and so on. So all of that is very interesting and worrying, and it's part of the dark side of inequalities, or the violent side of inequalities. But I think gender is very interesting because although there are not that many women in that top 1% of owners, they're there. They're there as wives, as mothers, as mistresses, as ex-wives, and so on, as daughters. And they're there all the way along the class distribution. But it's when you get to the bottom of that distribution, when gender intersects with these other kinds of identities, that you see the most intense forms of exploitation. And that you see, it's the very poorest women who are having to balance trying to earn a living and look after their own children, or having to go long distances to look after other people's children in order that their own children will have a better future. So, the gender angle of it plays out very differently, I think. There may be much more violence from marginalized men, but far more depression and lack of self-confidence, the inability to mobilize amongst women who feel trapped in their kind of roles. So I guess one interesting thing that I'm finding is, so how do women with any kind of agency, how do they react? And what I find interesting is because the labor market continues to be very segmented, very biased against women. The only kinds of jobs that they can get are, part-time, so that they can reconcile it with their caring responsibilities. Is as long as these workplaces are so hostile to women's unpaid responsibilities, that we are seeing women voting in a very different kind of way, and that is voting with their feet. There's something called a flight from marriage in many parts of Southeast Asia and so on. A birth strike, people refusing to have more babies. And I think, in Japan, I think they're facing a problem of a population getting older and older because, women will not have babies. They're trying to persuade them in South Korea with incentives and in Italy. So I think there's a very interesting form of a protest going on at the refusal of labor markets to accommodate unpaid work and the refusal of employers to accommodate unpaid work. And of course, the refusal of men within the families to take a fairer share. So I think some interesting factors going on in a very hidden way, I think, in these inequalities.
Thank you, Naila Kabeer. Saskia Sassen, Naila talked there about flight from marriage. Either one will do. Obviously, we have you in stereo.
Flight of marriage?
Flight from marriage. And I know you
That's not quite my subject.
No, but you have looked at flight.
I can talk about it. I'm not about to do that, though. My husband...
Right, no, you don't need to share anything with us. I'm thinking specifically of people, flight, people leaving because their situation is bad, trying something elsewhere, but often nowadays it actually seems to contribute to the inequality rather than solving it.
If I may, I was ready to talk in a more sort of thing that, and then I'll come to your question about people in flight. So on this question of inequality, we have always had inequality. And so the question is, are there inequalities that somehow work better than others? Second point, if there is something that marks the current epoch, its specificity. What is different today? Because today we have very distinctive forms of producing inequality, because inequality doesn't fall from the sky. Inequality is made, right? So it's made in a whole variety of ways. And so one issue for me that I cover a bit in my expulsions book, is that what we have seen, and I would mark sort of in most of the West, and by that I include Latin America, and it's not just Europe and the United States, let's say. It's a broader area. It also includes parts of Asia and parts of Africa. But I would say that one thing that has struck me as a very significant emergent condition is the rise of extractive logics. So traditional banking sells money for a price. It's commerce. And we all sort of need a bit of commerce. It sort of facilitates life, etc. High finance, which is, of course, the dominant form today, is an extractive sector. It does not sell something it has. I like to say, it's a bit of an exaggeration. It sells something it does not have. And in that sense, it's getting it out of somewhere. So just to give you an example, student debt, since we are in a university, I thought some of you might be interested, but I don't think you have that condition here. So student debt in the United States has reached $1 trillion. It's over $1 trillion. Now, the traditional bank wouldn't know what to do with that. Debt. High finance. $1 trillion. I can work with that. This is terrifying, you understand? Any negative can be manipulated in such a way that it generates something. So, for instance, the high financial system has decided to ask Congress, our rather problematic Congress, in the United States, to please never excuse that debt, that student debt. They passed a law. That is a debt that can never be cancelled. So if the student dies, God forbid, the parents or somebody else is going to be responsible. And you stand back and you say, why? Why did the financial system want that? What lies behind that? And this is just an extreme example of sort of this notion of an extractive logic. Well, it turns out that they can work with that. They can actually, as long as it is a massive concentration, if it's a little bit, it doesn't work. So that is just one indication for me that brings me back to this notion that what marks the current period, which for me, I repeat, sort of really takes off in the 1980s in many parts of the world, is the rise of extractive logics. We tend to think that the extractive is only like mining, etc. Well, the Coca-Colas and the Nestles and the other 28 bottlers, water bottlers, not Okay. And so they go around the world getting land, and it's an invisible operation to the eyes of, say, if you're in a plane, and they keep extracting water. And when they're done extracting it, they move on. So as a consequence, we have a lot of dead land left behind. This is happening in the United States, in California, where we have a drought. Several of the big bottlers, Nestle, are extracting water. So you have to stand back and say that the kind of inequalities, if we come back to that term, that we have today are marked by a brutality of extractive notions that takes us beyond some earlier epochs. Like I would say in the United States, for instance, after, before the 1980s and after World War II, there was a kind of an era. Of course we had inequality, but one big difference with today's inequality was that the key actors, the corporations, the banks, all wanted the sons and daughters of their clients to do better because they depended on them. And today that need for masses of people who are your consumers, who are your clients, has really declined. It exists for certain sectors, but not for the dominant sectors. So that to me marks a real difference. I know I should shut up now. No, I said enough.
It's fine.
Yeah, because I could go on and on. So
There'd be more chances. Well, I mean, now that we're all suitably depressed, let's look again at the title here of our debate, Engines of Equality, Elites, Politics and Power. And I think my question, partly because this is an event organised by a UN body, the United Nations, is where is that multilateral soft power? Where nowadays is our power? Because we see the elites, and although it's become a strange word in fact nowadays, but we see power being concentrated more centrally in many cases, and also more undemocratically in that it's with business rather than with elected politicians. So where is the power of the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN's business and human rights? Jomo, are these useful instruments? Can we use them at all?
They are certainly very, very important and very useful, but I'm not sure that multilateral arrangements have survived very well in recent times. Mm-hmm. Multilateralism is at great risk, and even in multilateral organization which is not strictly speaking within the UN system, the WTO, is in serious trouble. The leader of the most important country in the world insists that the future lies with bilateral trade arrangements and plurilateral trade. And perhaps...
He says trade wars are good, actually.
Well, trade wars are good if he can win them.
Yeah,
if he can win them, and if they serve they serve the creating the impression that he is making, America great again. I think that's all very. You don't want a trade war where you're going to lose, or even a trade war where you don't come out on top and people realize it. Okay, in fact, in most trade wars, both sides lose. Okay, and this is likely to happen. So, but as long as people believe that their people are better off, and what we have seen, and part of the reason why the Republicans have done reasonably well in the Senate races is precisely because you have close to full employment in the US, you have the stock market continuing to rise, and the general impression, because there is a whole generation which equates economic well-being with stock market performance, which equates economic well-being with full employment. And they even if their own personal conditions are difficult, they have the impression that that things are better off right now. One can't say the same thing about Europe. One can't say the same thing about Japan. And this is part of the reasons why there are what might be called legitimacy crisis for those in power in all these countries. I mean, look at how various political parties, their fortunes have changed so dramatically between one election and the next. And you know, I think, so one has to begin to understand that there are many different strands in contemporary politics. But at the end of the day, what is crucial is power maintenance and the projection of power, being able to anticipate where future sources of power are going to come from. And this is why initially when people started using terms like social capital and cultural capital and all the rest of it, I was very uneasy with it. But now I've sort of reconciled myself to it, because if you see capital, all the use of the word capital as expressions of power, then it makes more sense. Political capital, cultural, etc., etc. And so I think what we have at the level of multilateralism, multilateralism was never meant to be taken very seriously. When the League of Nations was created, for instance, it was a league of imperial powers. Okay, I mean, the rest of us were not there. Okay, now the United Nations was different, and part of the difference was because of Roosevelt's recognition that the old imperial order could not hold. The center could not hold. And there was a need to move beyond that and to try to develop new arrangements. And so there was always this tension in terms of trying to create a new world order, the economic order, Bretton Woods conference, the trade order, etc., etc. And this has always been at tension. But what we now see, especially in the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War basically meant it basically gave way to the rise of what some Americans call sovereigntism, US sovereigntism, that America as number one. Remember in the 80s, some of you might be old enough to remember people would write books like Japan as number one. Nobody writes books like that anymore.
With the end of history, I remember that one.
Right, right. So we have a situation now where clearly we are in transition, but transition is not a very helpful concept because we're always in transition. In retrospect, we realize that every period is always a period of transition. But what I see being fundamentally threatened in the last 3 decades, and especially in the current period, is the multilateral order. And so how this is going to be put together again, now that Humpty Dumpty is really fallen, is going to be extremely difficult. And we are going to find all kinds of attempts to create quasi-multilateral arrangements where the rules are bent and you have 2-tier rules and various other arrangements. So what you have in the UN system with the UN Security Council, permanent members and so on and so forth, you will find that increasingly replicated in more formal terms, not just informally as is often the case.
Naila, I want to ask you maybe also from a gender point of view. I mean, Jomo mentioned many, many multilateral organizations, Bretton Woods, World Trade Organization, the United Nations. Now, the very people and millions of women who might actually benefit from global rules and standards don't trust them anymore. So, I mean, can we address that trust? Or have these big organizations betrayed the real needs of the poor, and particularly women?
I think one of the things that has struck me quite a lot about, and when I look at the kind of organizations that I'd be interested in terms of intervening around equity issues, obviously the UN is one of them, the ILO and all of these organizations. And what I find quite troubling is that part of this triumphalism of the post-Cold War period has meant the under-resourcing of many of these organizations. And therefore, an increasing turn to the private sector and an increasing partnerships with business, which up to a point may work, but when we're trying to talk about justice and redistribution, then the private sector is not really well placed to be arguing for it. And I see that very much with UN Women. You set up an institution which is supposed to pull together all the different bits of the UN's work on gender, and it remains deeply under-resourced. And so it is having to do its work in partnership with whichever philanthropist or private sector partner is willing to pay for projects. So at the one hand, you've had deregulation at the global system. You've had the race to the welfare bottom. And so very many people who did enjoy some degree of welfare provision are losing it. And for women, that is a double whammy, because it means not only cuts in pay and poorer working conditions, but also cuts in welfare provision. But for those already at the welfare bottom, it means there is no hope of coming up. The capacity of governments, the capacity of the UN agencies to fund provisioning at that level has been deeply curtailed. So, you've seen the race at the bottom, and you're also seeing a failure of movement of people at the very bottom.
Saskia Sassen, no hope? That seems...
Oh God, that's not my subject.
Hope.
No, hope is not my subject. Hope.
Okay, well, let's stick with hope then.
No, but can I again be a bit subversive? And
Yes, that's what we're all here for.
Because hope is not really. I don't. It's a term that I rarely use, so I don't know exactly what to do. I don't mean to be difficult here, but I just wanted to go back to some of the issues that we've been talking about. And one of them, coming back to your first question to me that I changed, this question on immigration. Given what I described before about land grabs, water grabs, what is happening when we look at an image, say, of much of Africa, parts of Asia, and much of Latin America, we see still a lot of land, etc. Well, a lot of that land is dying. A lot of that land is being subjected to extractive modes, etc., etc. So coming to the migrant, what I see in our current modernity, and this probably holds more for the West broadly understood, is the emergence of a third type of migrant subject. And this is a subject, when she appears at our borders, she has no claim that she can make. She doesn't exist. So we have two regimes, right? The traditional immigration regime and the refugee. This third migrant subject is a victim of modes of economic development that our systems, our measures register as a positive, GDP per capita growth, a very problematic measure that people like Joe Stiglitz and Amartya Sen have been fighting against for 10 years, saying this is a distorted measure. It doesn't help us understand. But anyhow, you have a lot of people that are being expelled from their land because a mine is coming, because plantations are coming, because there are 35 governments that are actually installing vast plantations, especially in Africa, but also in Latin America and in parts of Asia, right? And so what is the effect of that? It's to expel smallholders. The term smallholder, is that familiar? Small farmers, rural people, to expel them from their land. When they appear at our borders, so to say, this third migrating subject, the way they are seen is, oh my God, but you come from a country that is doing very, very well. GDP per capita is growing. You have all these plantations and these mines and building new cities, etc. What is left out of that, of course, is that all that building, all that land grabbing, expels a lot of people. So this third migrant subject, not recognized in law, for me is a very significant indicator of two things. One, so many things that are wrong and that are marked by expulsions of one kind or another of people, especially modest people, clearly from their land. And secondly, what we don't see. You know, our categories of analyses, the terms that we use are keeping us from recognizing the emergence of new types of subjects, of new types of conditions. And I would say that really starting for me in the 1980s in many parts of the world, we have entered a new mode of economics. Now, complex systems, mode of economics nowadays are complex systems in many ways. They are not necessarily highly visible. It's difficult sometimes to understand what is happening. So that is another difficulty. The main point that I want to make is this notion, this image of this third migrant subject, not recognized in law, imperfect as the other two laws are, but this is the third, there's no law, and the fact that when she appears at our borders, she's told, hey, your country's doing very, very well. GDP per capita is growing. So the silo that produces, yes, knowledge and also ignorance about all the other things.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I will actually go to, unless, okay, yes, sure.
This is to add to
yes.
something. Is this on? Yes.
Yes.
This thing about GDP is very interesting because I remember one fine day last year we woke up and we were told that Bangladesh had been classified as a middle-income country. I mean, yesterday we were a low-income country, today we're a middle-income country. Nothing had changed.
And yes, we've heard
Nothing
a couple of countries
changed.
closer to home, apparently it's the end of austerity. Now, I would like to open to the floor because we do have to finish at 8 o'clock. We want to have some summings up. I am looking not for long speeches, as I said. I'll take a couple of points, then we get the audience to respond. I think you, sir, had your hand up first.
Picking up on what was just discussed, it seems relevant to ask the question, if you could speak briefly to this direct connection between, say, extractive practices and the fact that when the extraction is finished, they usually leave behind, of course, as you say, toxic waste and other things. So there's no going back, in fact, for these people. So now in Lausanne, a couple of nights ago, I saw a couple of these double-long city buses filled with I'm guessing, sub-Saharan African people in the middle of the night going somewhere by police escort. I'm not sure what was happening, but it was just vividly reminding me that this isn't the fact. These people are here because, of course, these extractive industries. Can you speak a little bit, because this seems to be lost a lot in the complexity, the direct line between extractive industries, the destruction of water, soil, resources, and now, as I understand also, for example, in India now, they're among the first programs that's effectively pursuing interjurisdictional regulation of air quality because of pollution effects and so forth. That's my question. Thank you.
We'll take a question from the lady here at the front. We'll take a couple of questions and then go back to our panel. I see the hands. Please don't be angry with me if we get to the end and I haven't come to you. I will do my absolute best.
Hi, thank you. This is Simel from the ILO. I was thinking as you were talking about this quote, I think it's attributed to Gramsci, the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, and it's the time of monsters. So, you know, we talked about the monsters. But I was wondering if you could share some thoughts about resistance strategies, response strategies. So perhaps the hope question you didn't answer, Saskia. And this could be the traditional forms, like, you know, what could trade unions do differently? What could social movements do differently? But then also new forms, like the social and solidarity economy emerging among the indigenous, among unemployed youth, in the context of, for instance, taxi drivers resisting Uber by cooperatives using platforms, but with the support of municipalities. But then the driverless cars are coming too. So what do you do then? Resistance strategies.
Okay, I'm going to ask Saskia to address the question on extractive practices, and then Jomo and Naila, resistance tactics, which is something that I would like to know myself as well. Saskia first.
Well, I think that one of the issues that is happening, and I think we're all vaguely or not so vaguely aware of, is the growth. It's called the growth of cities, that everybody wants to come to cities, etc. That's only partly true that everybody wants to come to city. The problem is that so many people are being expelled from their small rural plots, because those rural plots, and again, I mentioned before, there are 30 governments that are big buyers of land. For instance, the Saudis just bought up all the fields in Bosnia. Told the Bosnian farmers who are poor, and they were very happy, said, okay, here is money for you to take a vacation for the rest of your life. And they were delighted, but you cannot come back. We are going to send you to a beautiful... Can you believe this? I mean, this is unbelievable stuff. Now, in this case, I will say that those Bosnian farmers were very happy, okay, because it was going to be a better life. But it just gives you an idea of what's happening, and that is the preciousness of land. It's like we're going back to an older era where we were fully aware of the precious... French, the second or third generation of French farmers, about 5 years ago, were trying to get back to the old farmlands. They were all bought up by big corporations, both French and foreign. So there is something happening around the question of land, which also means habitat. That is very serious. Now, coming back to what we call in Spanish, I grew up in Latin America, la periferia, with the periphery, which are these big, dense settlements, sometimes reasonable, sometimes not so reasonable, around big cities. A lot of those people, it's not that they want to be in cities. They've been expelled. That is the last place they have. This is very interesting. And so the city, I argue, for instance, that the city contains within it today's frontier. If we think of the frontier as a space where actors from different worlds have an encounter for which there are no established rules of engagement, that is no longer happening in rural areas. No, it used to be in our imperial mode, right? Now it's happening inside cities. So in that sense, for me, it's extremely important that the city be a city, which means that you have incredible mixes of people, etc., etc. Now, I know I was meant to answer, but I'm an anarchist. I don't know if you noticed that.
I noticed.
I just talk about what I think hits my head. But was there something else you wanted me to address? I've sort of done it, right?
Let's actually ask Jomo and Naila first. We were asked about resistance tactics, and Saskia, if you have any, then we'd be interested to hear from them. But Jomo first, and then Naila.
Well, I think on the question of multilateralism, which was the second subject raised, I think it's extremely important to defend the multilateralism. It is one of the few, I wouldn't say necessarily very democratic, but one of the few spaces available to developing countries and to poor countries. One has to remember that if you think about overall inequality in the world, 2/3 of that inequality is geography. It's not class, it's geography. Okay? So this basically means that this has tremendous implications. So as long as the South, the global South, remains in conditions where people want to move out, you're going to have constant pressure to move out. Not necessarily to urban areas, but still there will be. Now, I think realistically speaking, one has to remember that the Gilded Age, the age of gross inequality, the age of the Great Gatsby in the United States, ended with the Depression, And following the Depression, you had two tendencies, the rise of the left and the rise of the right. Okay? In Europe, we know where that went. It was the right which was ascendant. Now, this time round, the left is almost gone. There is no significant left presence in the world today. And this, I think, is extremely important for us to remember, that capitalism is the only game in town. Okay? People are debating about the rules of capitalism. They're not debating about whether or not to have capitalism. And this, I think, is fundamentally a fundamentally different situation, and it constrains the range of possibilities. So I would say that some of the newer property rights, which are the basis for elite entitlements, have to be fundamentally challenged, including, and especially I would say, two things. Intellectual property rights, which have been the basis for new monopolies, because the intellectual property right confers a monopoly right. Okay? And the second is the power of finance. Finance has to be re-subordinated to the needs of the people, re-subordinated to the real economy. And the last point I would like to make is to begin to think about how one can reorganize society in ways where you would be able to redistribute power, if you will, through the very mechanisms. So, for example, if care work were to be monetized, that would empower all care workers, the majority of whom are women. If, for example, there is a recognition that the decisions about food at home and empowering people to make better nutrition decisions through the food choices and so on, all this can fundamentally improve the quality of life, in my view. And this, I think, is extremely important. So one has to think, of course, about how the tax system can be changed, how we begin to think not only about taxing income, but also about taxing property, inheritance, etc., etc. And if, insofar as we are now have resigned ourselves in many of our societies to consumption taxes, whether they are value added or not, then we need to begin to think about how we tweak the system of consumption taxes in ways which are less regressive.
Naila Kabeer, resistance tactics.
Okay. I think what is most antithetical to resistance is the lack of optimism. You know, I think hope is a driver. A sense of injustice is also a driver. For me, I think there is no single blueprint for resistance. It has to be local, and it has to address whatever it is, the sense of injustice that is driving. And the other thing is that it has to be collective. So the issue is, what are the localized issues of injustice that will help to build a collective? Some of it will be a trade union. But you cannot, and this is my despair, that you cannot build a trade union out of nothing. And we are facing that problem in Bangladesh. We have a history of very politicized trade unions, very partisan trade unions, for whom workers' interests come second to party interests. So we're getting a lot of people coming in from all over the world trying to pay for a new trade union movement. But that takes a long time for that culture to take root. So I think we should look beyond trade unions. And there are so many other different forms of collectives, including, if you like, the self-help group movements, women's cooperatives, informal workers' organizations. All of them contain within them, I think, seeds of building up a broader and more unified collective movement. And we mustn't forget the power of the media. And what has been very interesting about the Me Too movement, I had to come to that, didn't I? What has been very interesting about it is, first of all, how it has galvanized awareness of a problem that I myself did not know the depth of and the extensiveness of. We knew about harassment in the workplace, but I had not realized how far. What I think is very interesting is how it's taking off in India. And why that's interesting is because it means that the women who are speaking out are not afraid to speak. It's not taking off in Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. And that says something. I mean, I have problems with the Indian regime at the moment, but it does say something that these women are able to stand up and accuse very powerful people. And that has happened through the media. So I think technology holds within it also a power to build a kind of global platform against these issues.
Can I just add something on the technology? So I have a project going which has to do, I did quite a bit of research on what sort of, to put it very simply, apps, that we can deploy exist for low-income workers at their workplace and in their poor neighborhoods, and men and women and young people. And there's very little. They're invited to buy whatever, is a consumption, but not, and so we have been working with a whole bunch of doctoral students, so it's not commercial, to develop, and I will be very happy to send Open Society, I wrote a very long piece about this for Open Society, and a whole bunch of apps that are very simple, that allow a worker who at the workplace cannot simply pull up a telephone and start calling if there is a crisis back at home. Just clicking on a little app, poof, but there is a long list of them for different purposes. And then it mobilizes people in the neighborhood or whatever, so that there is a delegation. And that's also beginning to build up a bit of community sense. Huh? So this, you mentioned it in passing, or you did, this also this notion of relocalizing what we can relocalize, giving value again to the locality. And so if I need a computer, I've got to get a franchise, right? I mean, I'm not going to go to the factory. But do I really need a multinational to have a cup of coffee in my neighborhood? No, right? So those are sort of the two extremes. So that what we can begin to again do locally, in small settings. So I think that there are multiple little strategies. I mean, this is not going to bring in justice in a very big way, but these are first steps that mobilize people, that create new alliances and new solidarities in a way.
Great. The gentleman there, I'm going to take three together, and that might be the end. So gentleman there, and the lady with the dark hair behind him.
Thank you. This is Arthur Dahl. I'm going back to the question of intellectual property and inequality. I'm just going to share some more comments on the privatization of science and academic knowledge being sucked up by multinational publishers and available only to the rich, and therefore science gains by being shared. You can no longer share, particularly it no longer can be localized. People should access at the local level. They cannot when you have to pay $37 to read a scientific paper. So some comments on this issue in an academic audience I think would be quite relevant to our subject. Thank you.
The gentleman there.
May I speak in French?
Oui.
Donc, il me semble qu'il y a deux problèmes qui sont peut-être écartés et qui font qu'il y a beaucoup d'agressivité sur l'inégalité. C'est la pression démographique et la menace du réchauffement climatique. Ces deux pressions font qu'il y a une sorte de conscience générale selon laquelle on sait qu'il n'y aura pas de place pour tout le monde. Et ce sentiment qu'il n'y aura pas de place pour tout le monde entraîne une agressivité à tous les niveaux. Alors je ne sais pas comment vous pensez cette pression à la fois démographique et environnementale. Et il me semble qu'il est nécessaire de travailler à une pensée qui vise à penser le développement autrement que sur le plan économique et sur le plan de nos rapports aux autres.
Merci. I'll translate once we've had this next question. The lady there, and then we'll wrap them up.
Hi, my name is Veridiana. I work at the United Nations. I wanted to ask about social policies. Jomo touched upon redistribution policies, but how do you see the role of social policies, social protection, education, in tackling inequalities? Are these completely useless with current trends, or is there something we can do?
Okay, so we had a question about intellectual property again, and the value of scientific development, scientific research. Who owns it? We had a question from the gentleman there about the pressure on demographics, or the perception, I think, if I understood you correctly, that there isn't enough space for all of us, and that this creates tensions between communities, and how that can be addressed. And then finally, question from the lady there about social protection, and that's interesting. I was at a conference about that very thing at the ILO last week, where I learned a lot that I didn't know already. We are coming close to the end, so if you don't mind, I think it's going to be the last questions from the floor. I would ask our panelists to address these particular issues, and then we'll move to a summing up where we find some solutions which we hope are not of the Marie Antoinette variety.
I think the question raised about the corporate control of knowledge is a very real problem. But I think the example is only one of many, many examples which can be given. I remember an article a few years ago about how the Sugar Foundation financed Harvard's nutrition department research and basically gave it a clean bill of health in the 1960s. And at each stage, the head of the department, another man who later wrote the US dietary guidelines, and a third researcher sent drafts, because in those days there was no email, you sent drafts to the Sugar Foundation for approval. And this was the degree of accountability, if you will, in a very perverse way, which was happening. And there are many, many other examples. But the problem with copyright is a real problem. It's a real problem, and now there are attempts to extend and we have a concentration of publishers in the world, not just newspaper publishers, but also scientific or academic publishers. And the profit imperative is such that we have an increasing insistence on this. I remember one of the first things I had to do when I joined the UN in 2005 was to resist a lot of pressure from, among other things, from member states to make money from UN publications. And this, just imagine the public goods which governments routinely have to provide at the UN. We were supposed not to share those responsibilities. So it is a real problem. But there's also the problem of the fact that you have a lot of authors and performers, etc., who have no other way of being remunerated, and we need to find a way out. But I appreciate the spirit of your question, and that is that we should not simply accept the intellectual property rights regime which we have now, which is reinforced by the WTO, and not challenge it. Fundamentally, it should be challenged, and there are many, many scientists and others who would challenge this. If I may skip over the second question and go straight to the lady who raised the question of social policy. I think it is very important for us to recognize that there are huge debates going on about social policy. And UNRISD, the host of who has organized this event this evening, has been at the forefront of many of these debates. I think ultimately, however, the debates will not be resolved by superior knowledge of one type or another. They will be resolved by politics. It's going to be essentially resolved by politics. And it is therefore, it is imperative, therefore, for advocates of social policy to take two things into consideration. One is path dependence, what what social scientists like to call path dependence. You cannot just wish away the past. You have to build on the past. You have to build on what is considered to be socially legitimate in a particular society. For Theda Skocpol, for example, when she talks about American social policy, the two areas were one, mothers, and two, veterans who came back from wars, and this was how social policy began in the United States. And likewise, one has to be sensitive to the histories of our different societies in terms of trying to make proposals. But one of the other challenges in designing social policy is this fetish right now with targeting. And I actually have found instances where there is money being spent on trials and less money spent on actual social protection. And I generally think that one of the big problems with targeting is that the whole process of targeting suffers from what statisticians call type 1 and type 2 errors of exclusion as well as errors of inclusion. But the other problem, of course, is that targeting becomes exclusive. And exclusion basically means reduction of political support. So what one should begin to think about are ways of redistribution where you will not erode political support for a social program, because once you do not have strong political support for that program, you can be sure the program won't last.
Okay, thank you. Saskia, would you like to answer the point raised by the gentleman there to do with demographics and the one that was in French? We've got translation though, so you can answer in English.
I was just thinking of what I was going to say.
No. We have our lovely ladies here.
Alors je trouve que, well, I should speak in English, I
yes,
guess, otherwise we have a little chaos here. Well, I think that you are right in pointing out sort of the limits, in a way, also of knowledge, if I got it right. We need knowledge, but we need also transversality. So this is for me now a big deal, that I'm arguing that we are existing in knowledge silos that have worked for a while very well, and that now we need transversalities. We need to connect stuff that we're now not connecting. Now, that can get you into a lot of trouble, if you're an academic, because the silos are still very powerful. And so I tell my students okay, fine, you want to hang in there in the silo, in the paradigmatic, but go to the edges of the paradigm, where the paradigm is weak, and it runs into other paradigms. I really am in the book Expulsions, I really deal with that also, sort of cut across. We need transversalities. Number two, very quickly, very briefly, I think there are vast areas that need a knowledge function on the part of us scholars, researchers. We're forgetting that they exist, and that comes back to that transversality that I'm calling for, that we are still stuck in fairly narrow domains. So I look a lot at finance, right, at high finance, which is algorithmic mathematics. Nothing to do, with traditional banking, nothing to do with microeconomics, and nothing to do with macroeconomics. It's algorithmic mathematics. So what happens there? So, for instance, a building. We see the building. With algorithmic mathematics, you transform this building into something that's completely different. Where actually pieces of a wall, a toilet, whatever, can be used to produce asset-backed securities. So right now we're living in a moment when a lot of what we see with our eyes, which we used to think the thing is the thing, no. empty towers in Manhattan, fancy, fancy buildings, where people say, oh my God, it didn't go well for the planners or the builders. No, 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 an empty building right now, and this is happening in many parts of the world, including in Europe. An empty building now produces more value for the owners because it's empty than if it were occupied. When it's occupied, there are people to deal with. Right now, it functions as asset-backed securities. Now, algorithmic math means like 6 or 7 very complex steps. You know, it's really, we see the building, but the building is something else. So that is one of the issues, I think, that, again, we need to engage these kinds of subjects. As long as we stay in our knowledge silos, these are the kinds of things that we then don't see. Did I do what you asked me to do?
Yes, I think so.
Oh, very good.
Naila, do you want to answer particularly the question on social protection?
Yes. Okay.
That's what she likes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Got
Well,
that one
it's
right
really
then.
interesting because
And then we'll-
last week we had a workshop at LSE with the IMF, and the IMF wanted to discuss universalism. And I think someone said that this is IMF is at a beverage moment, you know. But it is about politics. It is about Christine Lagarde, who wants to, I think, to some extent, get the IMF to open up to different kinds of ideas. But I think for those of us who've been working on the area of social protection, I think we don't just rely on the fact that there is supposed to be a right to social security. We try to make other kinds of arguments. One set of arguments is the ones that Jomo made about the costs of targeting, you know, that it can, you can end up paying more just to try and administer this. But I think we might also want to make a difference between means testing and categorical targeting. So for instance, you might, I think one of the discussions we had was you might want to have universalism in basic services that everybody needs. You know, health, education, etc. But you might want to combine it with targeting the elderly, targeting very young children, targeting underserved areas. The means testing aspect drops out of that. So that kind of, you know, administrative cost drops out of that. But I think one of the reasons I became interested in social protection is that if we live in a world that is characterized by risk and insecurity, that is the norm, globalization renders some skills obsolete, you know, and others required, then social protection or built up as social policy is, I think, what all countries have to invest in to both protect their citizens from these fluctuations in the market, but also to prepare them for, you know, future skills and so on. So I think the arguments that we're making is about social protection as a social investment, that it is an investment in the quality and the future of the labor force and of the population.
Okay, thank you very much. We've come almost to the end. Sorry, because we really are at the end. But I do want to get our 3 panelists to have a brief summing up. Again, we'll come back to the title of this debate, Engines of Inequality, Elites, Politics and Power. And we have touched on many, many engines of inequality in this debate, from property rights of the intellectual kind, scientific kind, also land rights. We've talked, perhaps not directly, but it was there in our debate, about conflict and climate change and the kind of population pushes that leads to. We've talked about gender politics. Now, all of these are engines of inequality. And some of our discussion, I have to say, has been a little bit bleak, and I wonder what the future is facing my 2 children, who are both university students now. So, very briefly to sum up, I would like to ask each of you to name an engine of equality, not inequality. What can we start using to maybe start closing that gap? Where's our fuel?
I think it'll be necessary to challenge the major elite discourses. I think, for example, if we take, for example, the power of finance in the world today, Saskia, your response to the gentleman who asked the question in French, I thought was gave me an idea about the future of finance is cubism. but anyway, coming back to finance, the end of Glass-Steagall, which was the major regulation in the United States, was initiated by the Clinton administration, not by Mr. Trump. And a decade later, when the crisis happened, the conditions for the emerging out of the crisis was such that 95% of growth since the crisis has gone to finance. Okay, that was made possible not only by Mr. Bush but also by Mr. Obama. So I think one has to begin to recognize that if we stay within the domain of rival elite discourse, political discourses, we are unlikely to break out of it. And so especially since we're at a university, I think our challenge is really to build an alternative discourse, but an alternative discourse which is cognizant about the necessity to challenge power, but at the same time the need to build a broad alliance to challenge that power.
Thank you very much. Saskia, we'll ask you next. Briefly, an engine of equality.
Oh, right, I was going to talk about high finance.
No,
that's
no.
Definitely not. Well, what I see in the work that I'm also doing with poor neighborhoods, that where you have these people need each other in a way. They mostly hate each other because their lives are so difficult that they can't quite, but you begin to see a real mobilizing around recovering also knowledge functions in modest settings. So when everything is a franchise, does the term franchise mean something to you? So the flower shop. The flower shop used to be that you need to know what flowers when. There was knowledge, the accounting, the price. When the flower shop just becomes one little thing of a big multinational, you have taken out the knowledge function. This is happening all the time with all franchising. And that is something that I find very problematic. So one of the issues for me is how do we relocalize little knowledges, little efforts, because that is one way of recovering the knowledge, using the full intelligence even in the most modest of neighborhoods. It's not just about, the grand things.
Thank you. Naila, then the last word for you.
I want to combine the local and the global, because I think all the struggles against inequalities are strongest when they're rooted in local politics and local relationships. But at the same time, I think opening people's eyes up to what is possible outside their own communities, what is possible in communities elsewhere, the victories and the struggles that other people have had, I think feeds hope at the level of the local. So coming from a part of the world where I once went to visit Pakistan, and women had, till 1990s, not stepped beyond the dunes in which they were born. So they knew nothing about, this is in a desert. And those kinds of closed communities, I think, reproduce very, ancient tyrannies and so on. Mm-hmm. So I think opening people's eyes up to what is possible anywhere else is very important for local struggles.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, that just leaves it to me to thank our panelists, Jomo Sundaram, Saskia Sassen, Naila Kabeer, and to thank you all for coming, for all the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of you. But to say for me anyway, we know the statistics are bleak, but the ideas are brilliant. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you for coming.